The cadet field at Fort Durham stretched wide under a pale sky, the smell of dust and sweat carried on the restless wind as 500 young men and women lined up in formation. Their uniforms were stiff, their boots sharp, their eyes fixed on the towering wall at the far end of the infamous obstacle course. It wasn't just a wall, it was a slab of poured concrete rising nearly 20 feet high, smooth on the front, unforgiving on the back. For months, stories had spread about this course, about how it had been designed to break even the most stubborn cadet, to test not only muscle but will. They had all trained for weeks, rehearsing their leaps, their rope climbs, their sprinting lunges, but now, standing in its shadow, the wall looked like a different creature entirely. Commanders barked orders, stopwatches gleamed in the officers' hands, and the murmurs of nerves rippled down the line. The course had stopped every cadet who had faced it in the past 2 months. Not a single one had reached the top. Not a single one had even touched the midway mark before sliding down in frustration. Yet here they stood again, 500 strong, ready to try, to throw themselves at it until skin tore and pride cracked. The first whistle blew, shrill and merciless, and the front rank surged forward. Boots thundered on packed earth, cadets grunted, arms stretched high, legs launched into jumps. The first collided with the wall chest first, slapping down with a hollow smack. The second scrambled upward with clawing hands only to skid back and land hard on her shoulder. One after another they struck, clawed, kicked, leapt and fell. The wall ate their effort and spit them down like flies against glass. Some tried teamwork, hoisting each other up, but the rule was clear. No ropes, no tools, no assistance, only the raw ability of each cadet. Their desperation showed in their eyes as sweat streaked their faces, uniforms darkened at the armpits, and knuckles bled from scraping the unyielding surface. Minutes stretched into half an hour, the field echoing with grunts and groans and curses muffled under breath. The commanders exchanged knowing looks. They had seen this before. The wall was more than stone, it was a challenge meant to reveal who would keep striking even when defeat was certain, who would stand against impossibility and still swing. By the time the second whistle blew to signal rotation, the ground was littered with exhausted cadets. Some limped back in line, others panted with hands on knees, others simply sat where they had fallen, chests heaving, lungs rattling like drums in their ribs. Out of 500, not one had crested the wall. The officers shook their heads. Again tomorrow, one muttered, already ready to mark the day's result as another failure. And then the murmurs began, faint at first but spreading like sparks through dry grass. Someone was walking across the field, not in uniform, not in boots, not in formation. Just a woman. She wore plain cotton trousers and a loose blouse, sandals on her feet, and her hair tied back in a messy braid streaked with silver. She looked ordinary in every way, not a soldier, not an officer, not even a trainer. The cadets glanced at each other in confusion, whispering. The officers frowned, wondering if some civilian had wandered where she didn't belong. But she walked with a calm step, unhurried, almost serene, as though the wall were no more than a bench by the roadside. She stopped at the base of it, tilting her head back slightly. The wall loomed over her, that same impossible slab that had chewed 500 cadets into sweat and dirt. She did not measure it with her hands, did not pace back to take a running start, did not crouch to spring. She simply placed one palm on the surface, fingers trailing across the rough concrete, as though reading its story. And then someone noticed, her eyes were closed. Not squinting, not blinking against sunlight, but fully closed. A ripple of astonishment coursed through the watching crowd. The officers exchanged sharp whispers. Was she blind? Was this a joke? But before anyone could stop her, the woman bent her knees slightly, pressed her toes into the earth and began to climb. She did not grope like the cadets had, nor flail with panicked limbs. Her body moved as though it knew every hold, every seam, every hidden notch in the wall's surface. One hand rose and gripped firmly, the other followed in a graceful arc. Her sandals pressed against the smallest ledges invisible to the naked eye. She moved with rhythm, as though the wall itself had been whispering instructions into her ear. The crowd of cadets fell silent, their exhaustion forgotten, every eye pinned on the figure ascending where none of them had even reached the halfway point. She did not look down. She did not look up either, her eyelids sealed as though sight itself would only distract her. Her breathing was calm, steady, unbroken by strain. She reached the halfway mark, where every cadet had slipped, but her hand found a tiny ridge, her foot balanced on a flaw in the concrete, and she lifted herself higher without hesitation. Gasps rose as she passed the three-quarter mark. Even the commanders leaned forward, suddenly no longer bored record keepers but witnesses to something unreal. The woman's braids swayed gently behind her, catching the light as she moved, slow but unstoppable. Sweat glistened on her arms, but there was no desperation in her movement, only certainty. At last, with a final press of her legs, she gripped the top edge and hauled herself up with fluid strength. For a heartbeat she balanced there, standing on the crest of the wall, her eyes still shut, her chest rising and falling in tranquil rhythm. The silence below was total. 500 cadets and a ring of officers struck dumb as if the world had paused. Then she stepped down lightly on the far side, vanishing from sight as easily as someone stepping over a fence. For a moment no one moved. Then the field erupted, not in cheers but in stunned disbelief. Cadets shouted to each other, some swearing it had to be a trick, others insisting they had seen it with their own eyes. Officers demanded answers, scrambling toward the wall, peering at the surface, searching for hidden ropes or pegs or wires, finding nothing. It had been pure skill, pure knowledge, or something beyond either. And all of it had been done by a woman who had not even opened her eyes. The silence after she disappeared behind the wall seemed to last longer than the moment itself. The cadets, 500 strong, had seen something that contradicted everything they believed about strength, training, and ability. They had drilled for months, been conditioned to push their bodies to their breaking point, and yet none had touched the top of that obstacle. Then a woman, who looked as though she had never stood in a military formation in her life, had climbed it as if she were ascending the steps of her own porch. Not only had she done it without sight. The officers shouted for her to be stopped, ordering the guards at the far end to detain her. But by the time anyone rounded the wall, she was gone, vanished into the forest that bordered the grounds, leaving no sign of her passage except the stunned silence that hung heavy in her wake. Speculation broke out like wildfire. Some cadets swore she must have had hidden climbing hooks. Others whispered that the wall had been rigged for her, that the officers had orchestrated the entire spectacle to humiliate them. But when the commanders themselves examined the wall, running hands over the same unforgiving concrete, they found nothing. It was the same brutal surface that had shredded their palms earlier, the same featureless expanse that had defied them all. Still, there was something about the way she had climbed, smooth, confident, as though she were not struggling against the wall but listening to it, harmonizing with it. That image burned into their memories. Some cadets felt awe, others anger, and others a creeping sense of fear. For if one woman could conquer what 500 trained cadets could not, what did that say about the meaning of their discipline? The senior officer, Commander Halverson, stood in front of the formation, his weathered face tight with frustration. He had spent his life molding recruits into soldiers, into instruments of will and power. He believed in order, in method, in the slow chiseling of the weak into the strong. What he had just witnessed defied all of it. He barked the command for silence, and the cadets snapped back into rigid lines, though their eyes still flicked nervously toward the wall. What you saw, Halverson growled, was an anomaly, a trick. Do not think it lessens the value of your struggle. You are cadets, soldiers in the making, and you will face this wall until one of you conquers it the right way. Not through circus acts, not through tricks, but through training. His words rang with authority, but even he heard the hollowness in them. His voice had the edge of someone trying to convince himself as much as others. That night the barracks buzzed. No one slept easily. Some cadets replayed the moment in their heads, imagining her serene face, her closed eyes, her hands that seemed to know the wall without searching. A few argued she must have been blind all along, that she had adapted her body in ways they could not understand, sensing textures, ridges, and vibrations invisible to others. Others dismissed it as impossible, a fluke, some magic trick staged to test them psychologically. But deep down each cadet felt the sting of inadequacy. They had thought themselves strong, prepared, elite. Yet a stranger, a simple woman, had shown them that their strongest efforts were fragile compared to a strength that seemed rooted in something beyond muscle. The officers too debated furiously. Some wanted the incident buried, erased from record so morale would not collapse. Others wanted the woman found, interrogated, perhaps recruited if her skill could be replicated. Commander Halverson ordered patrols into the forest, but they returned empty-handed. It was as if she had vanished into air. And then, 3 days later she returned. At dawn, as the cadets lined up for another attempt at the obstacle course, the woman appeared again, walking out from the treeline with the same calm step, her sandals brushing against the morning dew. Gasps rippled through the formation. Officers moved to intercept her, but she ignored them and walked straight to the wall. Again she laid a hand against its surface, closed her eyes, and with the same graceful rhythm, she climbed. The cadets stared in rapture and rage. They wanted to dismiss it as luck the first time, But to watch her repeat it, effortless and precise, proved it was no accident. Commander Halverson roared for her to stop, but she didn't break pace. In less than 2 minutes she was at the top, standing once more on the crest with her eyes shut against the rising sun. Then for the first time she spoke. Her voice carried down to the field, soft yet clear. "You see the wall as an enemy. I see it as a path. The difference is not in the wall but in the eyes that look upon it." Then she stepped down again, vanishing from sight as before. This time silence did not follow. Shouts broke across the field. Some cadets demanded to follow her, to learn what she knew. Others spat on the ground, furious that their discipline was mocked by an outsider. Halverson was pale with fury, his fists clenched behind his back. Yet even he could not deny the truth in her words. She had not conquered the wall with brute force or blind chance. She had conquered it by refusing to see it as impossible. The wall had stopped 500 cadets cold, but it had not even slowed her. The cadets could not shake her words. They echoed in their heads as they sat through drills, as they marched across the dusty fields, as they lay in their bunks staring at the ceiling. "You see the wall as an enemy. I see it as a path." It was a puzzle, a riddle that gnawed at them. How could a wall, unbroken and smooth, be a path? The very idea contradicted everything they had been taught. Walls were meant to stop, to defend, to repel. Paths were for moving forward. To confuse the two was to deny the very structure of obstacles. Yet she had proved her philosophy twice, in front of 500 witnesses, with no tricks, no tools, no sight. The cadets began to argue late into the night, some claiming that she was mocking them, others swearing she was revealing a secret that might make them greater than soldiers. And beneath it all lingered the sting of failure. Every one of them, no matter how hard they tried, had failed. She had not. Commander Halverson felt the morale shifting like sand beneath his boots. He had built his career on breaking cadets down and rebuilding them in the Army's image, but now the Army's authority itself was questioned. If a civilian woman, blind or not, could humiliate them on their own proving ground, what did that say about the legitimacy of their methods? He called a council of officers in his dimly lit quarters, pacing before them with clenched fists. "She undermines everything," he growled. "Discipline, structure, respect for the chain of command. If they begin to believe that her way is stronger than ours, we lose the foundation of soldiering." Major Kessler, a broad man with a scar across his jaw, leaned forward and said, "Then perhaps we should learn her way. Capture her, question her, extract what she knows. If her method can be taught, it can be weaponized." But others resisted. "She's not a threat," one argued. "She hasn't harmed anyone. Perhaps she's teaching them something we have failed to see." The room broke into heated debate until Halverson slammed his fist on the table. "Enough. She will be found and she will be brought here. One way or another, this ends." The very next morning, as though she had heard his command, the woman returned again. This time she did not walk to the wall immediately. Instead, she stood at the edge of the field while 500 cadets sweated through the drills. Her presence unsettled them, their eyes flicking toward her instead of focusing on their tasks. Halverson stormed across the field, barking at her to leave, demanding to know her name, her purpose, her right to intrude on military grounds. She looked at him with her calm, closed eyes and said simply, "I came to climb." Her words infuriated him further. "You will do nothing unless I allow it," he thundered. But when he turned to see his cadets, he caught something that chilled him. Their faces were no longer hard and obedient but restless, questioning. They looked at her with a mixture of awe and hope, and at him with doubt. To forbid her might make him look weaker than allowing her. Against his better judgment he snarled, "Fine. Climb it then. But do it under my watch. And after, you will explain yourself." The woman approached the wall once more, her sandals whispering against the dirt. She placed her hand against it and waited, longer this time, as though feeling for something deeper than texture. Then she began to climb, and again the silence fell. Each movement was precise, deliberate, and yet graceful, as though she were dancing with the surface rather than struggling against it. When she reached the top, she did not immediately descend. Instead, she stood facing the cadets, still with eyes shut, and said, "You fail because you fight. You claw because you fear. But the wall is not your opponent. It is your teacher. It does not yield to anger. It yields to patience." Her words struck them harder than any command Halverson had ever barked. She stepped down the far side and walked back calmly into the forest, ignoring the officers who scrambled to intercept her. Once again she was gone before they could seize her. But the damage, or perhaps the gift, was done. The cadets whispered among themselves that night with newfound hunger. Some began to practice differently, not charging at the wall with fury but touching it, studying it, trying to sense the small imperfections as she had. They closed their eyes, mimicking her. Though none yet succeeded, their attempts no longer carried the same blind frustration. They were beginning to wonder if strength was not only in the body but in perception, in harmony with what stood before them. Halverson saw it happening and felt control slipping from his hands. His soldiers were supposed to follow orders, not riddles from a stranger. Yet he could not erase what they had seen, nor silence the words that had taken root in their minds. He paced his office deep into the night, knowing that if he did not find a way to reassert authority, the woman's presence would unravel his command. At last he muttered to himself, "If she is their teacher, then I must defeat her. Only then will they remember who leads." And with that resolve, Halverson began planning not to capture her, but to face her himself. On the wall she had made her throne. The challenge was inevitable. By the time the cadets assembled at dawn the next day, word had already spread like fire across the camp. Commander Halverson himself was going to face the wall, and he would do so against the woman. The officers tried to keep it quiet, but nothing stayed secret in a place where 500 restless cadets whispered in the dark. They crowded the field in a wide ring, hearts pounding, because this was more than a climb now, it was a clash of two worlds. On one side was Halverson, the embodiment of discipline, years of service carved into his body and voice, his reputation built on breaking obstacles through relentless force. On the other was the woman, nameless, ordinary in appearance yet mysterious, who had ascended the wall 3 times without faltering, eyes closed, as though the concrete itself bent to her will. The cadets buzzed with anticipation, some rooting for their commander to reassert the old order, others secretly hoping the woman would prevail again and prove her words were more than riddles. Halverson stood before them, stripped of his officer's coat, sleeves rolled up, muscles tensed like coiled rope. He turned to address his cadets, his voice sharp and commanding. "Today you will see that training is the only path to victory. Tricks and illusions crumble before true strength. I will show you that this wall can be conquered the right way." His words carried authority, but beneath the thunder there was something almost desperate, as though he knew he was fighting not just the wall, but the doubt that had infected his ranks. Then, as though summoned by his declaration, the woman appeared again from the treeline. The cadets fell into silence. She walked as she always did, calm, her braid brushing against her back, her sandals whispering on the grass. She gave no speech, no gesture of challenge. She simply placed her hand upon the wall and waited. Halverson snorted at her serenity and spat into the dirt. "No more games," he barked. At the officer's signal, both stepped toward the wall. Halverson attacked it like a soldier storming an enemy barricade. He leapt, muscles straining, fingers clawing for holds that weren't there. He dragged himself up, face twisted in effort, veins standing out in his neck. For a moment he gained height, but then his grip faltered, his foot slipped, and he slid back down, landing with a thud that rattled his bones. The cadets shifted uncomfortably, but he roared and leapt again, his pride too stubborn to yield. Each time he gained a little, each time he fell harder, the wall scraping his arms raw. Sweat poured down his face and dust clung to his skin. The woman meanwhile began her ascent without rush. Her eyes closed, her hands tracing the faint textures of the wall, her feet finding places invisible to those watching. She did not leap or claw, she rose. Slowly, steadily, as though gravity itself bent for her. With each movement she seemed less like a climber and more like a part of the wall itself, moving with its rhythm instead of against it. The cadets' breath caught in their throats. They had seen it before, but against the fury of their commander, her serenity seemed even more otherworldly. She reached the halfway mark while Halverson still flailed near the base, his arms trembling from strain. He cursed aloud, struck the wall with his fist and leapt again, but his desperation betrayed him. He fell once more, collapsing to his knees, chest heaving like a bellows. By the time Halverson had barely touched the wall's midpoint, the woman had reached the crest. She stood balanced at the top, eyes closed, the rising sun painting her in gold. The field was silent, all 500 cadets holding their breath, their commander kneeling bruised and gasping at the base. And then she spoke again, her voice carrying like a breeze. "Strength is not in conquering the wall. Strength is in listening to it. You see only height and resistance. I feel its shape, its story, the ways it offers passage. You rage against it and it throws you down. I yield to it and it carries me upward." Her words hung in the air, heavier than any shout Halverson had ever given. She lowered herself down the far side and vanished once more, leaving behind silence that weighed on every chest. Halverson staggered to his feet, face red with humiliation, his authority crumbling in front of the very cadets he had sworn to mold. He barked for them to disperse, to return to drills, but his voice cracked, the tone of command broken by failure. The cadets did not cheer his attempt, nor did they jeer. Instead they looked at him with something worse, pity. And worse still, some looked not at him at all, but at the wall itself, as if they were beginning to see it differently, not as an enemy but as a teacher, just as she had said. Halvorson stormed away, his pride bleeding like an open wound, but he knew the truth. He had been beaten, not by a soldier, not by an enemy, but by a simple woman who had revealed to his cadets a strength he could not match. That night the camp was not the same. The cadets whispered less in anger and more in wonder. Some began to close their eyes when they touched the wall, trying to sense what she had felt. Others sat quietly, replaying her words over and over. They no longer spoke of tricks or illusions. They began to speak of patience, of perception, of harmony. The seed she had planted had begun to grow, and no command, no punishment could stop it. Halvorson lay awake in his quarters, staring at the ceiling, knowing that his grip on them was slipping. He had always believed obedience was forged by fear and repetition. But now for the first time he faced the possibility that true strength might not be in control at all, but in the very thing he despised, surrender. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, a mist hanging low across the training grounds. The cadets gathered before the wall again, but this time their faces carried a different expression. No longer was it only dread and resignation. There was something else now, a quiet hunger, a strange light in their eyes. They had all seen her climb, had all heard her words, and though none of them fully understood, they could not forget. The wall still loomed tall and merciless, its surface mocking every attempt they had ever made. Yet some part of them began to believe that perhaps it was not impossible after all. Commander Halvorson barked his usual orders, voice harsh, but the tone carried less weight now. The cadets obeyed, but their focus was not on him. It was on the wall, and on the memory of the woman who had treated it not as an obstacle but as a companion. The first cadet to step forward was Cadet Lorne, a wiry young man with scars on his knuckles from weeks of failed attempts. He stared at the wall for a long moment, then did something no one expected. He closed his eyes. The others gasped, recognizing the imitation instantly. Halvorson's jaw tightened in fury, but he said nothing, not yet. Lorne pressed his palm against the cold surface, feeling its roughness, the slight ridges where the concrete had set unevenly. He breathed in slowly, steadying himself, and then began to climb. His movements were awkward at first, fumbling, uncertain. But instead of leaping wildly, he moved with deliberate care, testing each foothold, listening to the scrape of his sandals against stone. He did not make it far, barely a quarter of the way before slipping and falling hard onto the dirt. Yet when he rose, there was no anger in his face, only determination. Again, he muttered, dusting himself off. I'll try again. Others followed. Some tried with eyes open, attempting to copy her patience. Others closed their eyes fully, though fear made their hands tremble. Most fell, some faster than others, but the tone of failure had changed. No longer did they curse or pound their fists into the ground. They whispered to one another, trading what little they had felt. There's a slight ridge here, or, press your toes against the left side, it holds better. Slowly, painfully, they began to approach the wall not as a single hostile enemy, but as something that could be studied, understood, learned. It was no longer about conquering, it was about listening, just as she had said. Halvorson raged inside. He barked at them to stop imitating her, to follow the drills as ordered, but the cadets only half listened. The wall had become something else now, a test not of obedience but of perception. He punished some with laps, with push-ups, with grueling routines designed to break them back into submission, but the punishments only hardened their resolve. They whispered in the barracks at night, sharing their bruises with pride, whispering her words like a mantra. The wall is not your opponent, it is your teacher. What had begun as a mystery was becoming a quiet rebellion. One evening when the sun bled red across the horizon, Cadet Mira, one of the smallest in the unit, approached the wall alone. She was not strong like Lorne, nor tall like many of the others, but she had been listening more carefully than anyone. She placed her palm against the wall, closed her eyes and whispered to herself, not an enemy, a path. Her fingers traced upward, her feet shifted lightly, and slowly she began to climb. She did not soar, she did not leap, but she rose higher than anyone else had, reaching nearly halfway before her grip faltered. She fell, landing on her back with a gasp, but when she sat up, dirt streaked across her cheek, her eyes were alight with something fierce. The other cadets surrounded her, cheering quietly as though her small success belonged to all of them. For the first time the wall had given them hope. Halverson watched from a distance, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He could feel his authority slipping further each day. These cadets no longer looked at him as their sole source of strength. They looked to the memory of a woman who had never worn a uniform, never saluted, never shouted an order, and yet had shown them a way beyond his reach. That night, he summoned his officers and demanded strategies to break this influence. Some advised forbidding the wall entirely, others suggested doubling punishments. But one younger lieutenant hesitated before speaking. "Sir," he said carefully, "what if the wall was never meant to be conquered by force? What if she is right?" The room fell silent, and Halverson's glare could have cut steel. "She is nothing," he spat. "And anyone who believes otherwise is nothing as well." Yet even as he said it, he felt the truth pressing against him like the weight of the wall itself. Meanwhile, among the cadets, a quiet shift was taking place. They no longer measured themselves by how far they got before falling, but by what they learned each time. The wall was no longer a graveyard of failure but a classroom. Bruises became lessons, slips became notes to remember, and every attempt carried meaning. They began to sense faint ridges, hairline cracks, imperfections too subtle to see but tangible under their fingertips. It was as though the wall itself had begun to reveal pieces of its secret, rewarding those who approached it with patience rather than fury. And though none had yet reached the top, the cadets began to feel something strange and new. They were not fighting the wall anymore, they were becoming part of it. Days passed, then a week, and still the cadets returned to the wall each morning. Their uniforms grew ragged with dirt, their hands hardened into calluses, their knees and elbows scabbed from countless falls. Yet their spirits were no longer crushed. With every attempt they felt closer to unlocking a secret that had always been there, hidden in the concrete, waiting to be heard. They whispered less of failure now and more of discovery. They spoke of balance, of stillness, of listening to the rhythm of their breath against the cold surface. Some closed their eyes entirely, others half shut them, but all tried in their own way to step into the silence the woman had shown them. Commander Halverson tried to stamp it out with punishments, barking orders until his voice grew hoarse, but the fire in the cadets only spread. He could not command them to unsee what they had witnessed. The wall had become something more than an obstacle course. It was a revelation. It was on the 10th morning that everything changed. The cadets lined up, weary yet determined, the mist still clinging to the ground as the sun's first light broke through. Mira, the smallest cadet, who had nearly reached halfway before, stood quietly at the front. She had been practicing differently than the others, not rushing, not competing, but sitting for hours with her hand against the wall, breathing, memorizing its subtle lines. Where others strained their muscles, she trained her patience. That morning, without waiting for orders, she stepped forward. Halverson shouted at her to fall back in line, but she ignored him. She placed her palm flat against the wall, closed her eyes and whispered, "Not an enemy. A path." The cadets hushed, every eye fixed on her. She began to climb. Her movements were not fast but they were steady. She pressed her toes into a shallow indentation, found a faint crack for her fingers and rose. Every step was deliberate, every breath controlled. Her body swayed with the rhythm of the climb, as though she were flowing upward instead of struggling. She reached the quarter mark where most had failed. She passed it without faltering. Murmurs rippled through the formation. She reached the halfway point where even the strongest had slipped. She steadied herself, adjusted her weight and continued. A cadet whispered, "She's going to do it." Another hushed him as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. By the three-quarter mark, Myra's arms trembled, her breath quickened, but her face remained calm, eyes shut as if she were somewhere else entirely. Halverson barked at her to stop, his voice edged with desperation, but she did not hear him. She reached up, fingers brushing against the final ridge. Her foot slipped for a heartbeat, gasps broke from the crowd, but she caught herself, holding steady, clinging with the strength of not just muscle but will. Then with a final push she gripped the top edge and pulled herself over. For the first time, a cadet stood where only the woman had stood before, at the crest of the wall, the rising sun behind her, her chest heaving, her eyes still closed. The field erupted. Cadets cheered, some cried out in disbelief, others pounded their fists into the dirt with joy. Mira opened her eyes slowly, tears glistening as she gazed down at her comrades. She had done it, not by brute force, not by rage, but by listening, by patience, by surrender. She raised a hand, not in victory but in acknowledgement, and then climbed down the far side, landing softly. The cadets swarmed around her, voices tumbling over one another. How did you do it? What did you feel? Show us. Mira, still breathless, shook her head and said only, "The wall isn't against us. It's guiding us. I just listened." Her words echoed the woman's almost exactly, and the cadets felt their belief solidify into certainty. Halverson, meanwhile, stood frozen. His authority had been wounded when the woman climbed, but this was worse. A cadet, one of his own, had succeeded where he had failed. And worse still, she had done it not through his methods but through hers. His face twisted with fury, but no shout came. The cadets no longer looked to him for validation. Their eyes were on Mira and on the wall itself, which seemed less like an enemy and more like a promise. The transformation was complete. The rebellion of thought he had feared had become reality. That night, the camp was alive with energy. Cadets whispered strategies to one another, not about attacking the wall but about sensing it, feeling it. They practiced together, not competing but encouraging, pushing each other to find new grips, new balances. For the first time, they trained not as rivals but as allies. Myra's success had ignited something in them all. If she could do it, so could they, and if they could, then the wall would no longer be a tomb of failure but a shared triumph. In the dark barracks, they repeated her words like a chant, not an enemy, a path. The wall had stopped 500 cadets cold. But now, with one success, it was no longer an unscalable monster. It was a door waiting to be opened. And somewhere in the forest, unseen, the woman listened to their voices carry through the night. She smiled softly as if the lesson had finally taken root. She had not needed to climb again. Her work was being done for her, through them. The next morning the wall loomed exactly as it always had, but to the cadets it no longer seemed impossible. It was still tall, still gray, still merciless in its silence, yet something fundamental had shifted. Myra's climb had broken the spell. Now the cadets looked at it with a fire in their eyes, the kind of fire that spreads quickly once someone has proven the path is real. They gathered in ranks, but the order felt different, less rigid, more alive. They spoke in murmurs, exchanging encouragement, slapping each other's shoulders, smiling with anticipation instead of dread. Halverson barked for silence, but the energy could not be crushed. The wall was no longer his tool of control, it had become theirs. Halverson tried to reassert himself. He paced in front of them, voice sharp, commanding them to remember discipline, to follow orders, to not attempt what was outside their clearance. But his words bounced off their determination like arrows against stone. When he called Mira forward for questioning, demanding she explain herself, the cadets stepped forward as one, a wall of bodies standing between her and his authority. "She showed us it can be done," one shouted. "We're all going to try." The commander's jaw clenched, veins rising in his neck, but he saw it then. 500 pairs of eyes no longer feared him. Their loyalty had shifted, not to a person but to an idea, that the impossible was possible. He could not chain that spirit. Cadet after cadet stepped forward that day. They did not succeed at first. Many climbed with closed eyes, trying to emulate Mira, but slipped at the quarter mark. Others attempted too quickly, their excitement betraying their balance, tumbling back to the dirt. Yet not one of them gave up. Each fall brought not despair but laughter, a quick hand up from another and another attempt. The wall that once mocked them had become their teacher, and every bruise, every scrape was part of the lesson. Some even thanked it aloud after failing, as though it were alive and listening. The spirit of the camp had turned upside down. Mira herself spent the day guiding others. She walked alongside her fellow cadets as they tried, offering quiet words: "Slow your breath. Shift your weight here. Feel with your toes, not just your hands." She never claimed mastery, never lifted herself above them. Instead, she insisted that what she had done was only proof that they all could. "The wall speaks to each of us differently," she told them. "Don't copy me. Listen for yourself." Her humility deepened their respect, and before long others began to reach new heights. By noon, 3 cadets touched the halfway point without slipping. By evening, one cadet, Ramos, the broad-shouldered son of a farmer, pulled himself almost to the top, his hand grazing the ridge before he fell with a laugh that echoed through the trees. Halverson watched it unravel with growing dread. His greatest instrument of control was being dismantled before his eyes, not by sabotage but by courage. He tried punishments, ordering extra drills, cutting rations, shouting until spittle flecked his chin, but the cadets bore it all with a kind of cheerful defiance. They had found something stronger than fear. When he demanded Mira explain,